Hello, good morning. It's Beth from Ruth Stitchery and ruthstitchery.com, and we're talking borders today, putting them on our quilts, and it's been kind of a topic we've talked about doing a video on. And then in last week's video, when we talked about things that you need to know if you're going to bring your quilt to a long armor, Denise mentioned something about putting your borders on, and so we thought perfect time to do this video in putting borders onto your quilt top. And I have to be honest with you, when I first started quilting over 30 years ago, I self-taught myself. I kind of picked up a book and I kind of winged it. And at the time, I didn't really know that there were quilt classes you could take, or that there were actual specialty quilting stores. I had no idea when I first started quilting that that there was a place to go get instruction on this. And over time, I have learned all of the things that I should not have done when I started, just to be super successful and get a really nice, flat, nicely measured quilt. So when I first started, I would go to put a border on, and if it was longer than the width of fabric, I would sew 2 strips together, and I would just put that strip on top of my quilt top. I would sew down, and then I would just chop it off. And then I would do the same thing for the other side, and then of course top and bottom. So that is how I put my borders on. And I'll be honest, if you are pretty successful with your consistent 1/4 inch seam, your blocks are the size that the pattern says they're supposed to be, that particular method of putting a border on, you might be okay. However, there is a very good possibility that when you put that quilt on, that border on one side, and you chop it off, that you go ahead and you put the other border on, and say your quilt was about an inch difference in length on those 2 sides. Now you have 2 borders on there that could have possibly stretched as you put them on, and then you may not notice it by just looking at it, but you are off. Then you do the same thing for the top and the bottom. Maybe you're a 1/2 inch or an inch off on length on top and bottom, and now your quilt, even if you can't see it by looking at it, is not squared up. If it's a square, it's not a square. If it's a rectangle, it's not a rectangle. It's going to be a little bit off on one corner. And this kind of goes back to what Denise was saying, how if you are off in the length on your sides, you'll get rippling. Or if you've ever finished your quilt and then just laid it on the floor because you wanted to take a picture and wondered why it didn't lay completely flat, this is why. So I wanted to show you, yes, it takes a little bit more time to do, but it is totally worth it getting a nice flat quilt after you get your borders on. So basically what I do at this point, so here's my quilt top, here is my border, and I've done a pieced border, and because this quilt was set up with cornerstones in the corners, and it's square, all of my border pieces like this were the same size. And so I knew that at this point it's 54.5 inches. So I made one big long strip set that looks like this, and then I cut them at 54.5 inches because that is the size that I knew that I needed. And so this is what I do now for every quilt that I make. Whatever the length of that side that I'm on, I cut my border strip to exactly that length, and then I go ahead and pin it. So I'm going to show you what I kind of do. So if this is my border, I am going to fold this border strip in half, and I'm going to give it a really good kind of finger press right here so that I get a nice little crease so that I can see it. Some quilts are easier than others to know exactly where the center of the side of your quilt is. This is an easy one because I know where these two blocks hit. It is the center. And so I'm going to line that center crease that I just made in my border. I'm going to line that up with the center of my quilt, and I'm going to stick a little pin right there in the center. And then from there, I'm going to sort of smooth this out, and I'm going to, let me move that out of the way. I'm going to put a little pin right here in the corner where you can see the edge of my quilt and my border. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I'm going to line up the edge of my border with the edge of my quilt and put a little pin. And then depending on how long the edge is how many pins I may put in between. I don't like to pin a ton, but so in something like this, I would probably put like one more pin kind of halfway in between the edge and the center, and then the same thing on the other side. And then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew my border on. Something else to remember is I always put the border on the bottom and let the feed dogs run my border through, because this is a nice clean straight edge where if I flip this up, you can see that my quilt top has all the seams. I want to make sure that I have the quilt on top so I can see where my seam is hitting all of these, or where my 1/4 inch seam that I'm sewing the border with is where it's hitting on all of these. Maybe I don't want to cut off those points so I can see exactly where that seam is hitting. And so that is what I'll do. And then I will go ahead and do the exact same thing for the opposite side of my quilt. So if this were the sides, I would do the other side, same exact way. I would go ahead and press out to my border and then again do the same thing to the top and the bottom. And that way, if I have to ease my border at all, I am only doing it in little tiny, maybe 10 or 12 inch increments if I have to pull or stretch a little bit or ease something in. And that way I get no pleats and everything lies completely flat on my border. So that is how I put my borders on. And as I said, I didn't start off doing that. I had no idea that that contributes to your quilt being a little bit off. And of course, if you take it to a long armor, you could get pleats in your border. And so hopefully these are some tips that you can use. If you aren't already doing this when you put your borders on, I encourage you to start and you'll be more successful. Thanks for watching our videos. Please don't forget to follow us on Facebook and don't forget to share our videos.